Hello, how are you doing? This Saturday morning, what are you doing now? I am going to do a reading for the Daily Bible Reading Show. So welcome to the Daily Bible Reading Show. I was honestly going to do this, just for my first impressions, looking at today's passage, which is 2 Samuel chapter 6. But what happened was I discovered I actually preached on this before. So I'm of two minds. Do I do this with first impressions, or do I read my old sermon? I think I might do the safe thing, though the more boring thing, which is just to read this old text that I wrote out, 7 years ago. So, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the sermon entitled The Opposite of Joy. The Opposite of Joy, based on 2 Samuel chapter 6. This was preached on 23rd of November, 2014. Oh, actually, I remember when I gave this talk. This was to the Chinese fellowship. I remember this was when we had to switch premises. We had to move out of Henry Martin Hall, and I think this was the very first meeting we had, somewhere in the back of Modeling College, and I was given this passage, I guess. I can't remember whether it was a theme or a passage, but for what it's worth, I haven't read this. I'm not sure what's in store. It looks kind of long. So for what it's worth, here it is. The Opposite of Joy, based on 2 Samuel chapter 6. Okay, so the first heading is Psychopaths in Office. Psychopaths in Office. A 1982 report suggests the best people to run the UK government in the event of a catastrophe. A bomb, for instance, would be psychopaths. Psychopaths would make rational, not emotional, decisions. Psychopaths would be unaffected by loss and tragedy. Psychopaths would get the job done. You might think that's crazy, but don't we detach ourselves when we're facing a difficult decision? Don't get emotional, we say to ourselves. Don't take it personally. Today's talk deals with emotion, delighting in God, and desiring to serve Him. It's a step up from knowing God. We want to delight in Him, enjoy Him. It's a step up from doing God's will. We want to please Him, make Him smile. It's emotional, and that makes it uncomfortable. For those of us who are guys, delighting in God isn't manly. It makes it uncool. For those of us at Cambridge, we'd rather think about God than feel something about God. Yet the strangest thing about our topic today is not simply the fact that we're dealing with the emotion of a Christian believer. No, the strangest thing is we're going to look to a politician to teach us how to love God, a politician to teach us how to express our desire towards God. That politician's name is David, not David Cameron, but King David in the Bible. He is the man after God's own heart, 1 Samuel 13:14. He is the man who wrote songs to God, the Psalms, especially the first book of the Psalms, what are essentially love songs to God. And in our passage today from 2 Samuel chapter 6, he is a man determined to celebrate the love he has for God. David and the whole house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. This is 2 Samuel 2 verse 5. It's a worship service. David, wearing a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might, verse 14. I think of Hugh Grant in Love Actually, dancing around the apartment. Here David gets down and boogies in his pajamas. David said to Michal, "It was the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." Verse 21. She is calling him an idiot. And David's response is, "I don't care. I will celebrate before God." Here is a man determined to express his love towards God. Yet at the same time, we see a man struggling to sustain that love and devotion. Verse 8, Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzza. David was afraid of the Lord that day, verse 9, and said, how can the ark ever come to me? It's personal frustration. How can God ever be near me? He says in verse 9. What this passage teaches us is the biggest obstacle to David's joy is God. God is keeping David from enjoying God. It's not pressure, it's not the lack of prayer. The biggest problem you and I have when we don't desire God, when we find it impossible to love God, is God. It's not because we haven't tried hard enough. Because like salvation, love for God is something only God can do in our hearts. Only God can change your heart to love Him. More than your degree, more than your life, only God can do that. If that is true, the question you need to ask yourself is not, do I love God, but do I know who this God is? It's a fundamental question in any relationship. Do I know this person I'm claiming to love? We might say we love someone, but we might do it selfishly. The point is, we're not trying to psych ourselves into becoming more loving people. That's not the point. Love is other person-centered. The point is to look at God as He really is and to know Him and to love Him. It's knowing what pleases Him. So the next heading is Kingdom of Hearts. And here we see David doing that in chapter 6. But just before we look at the passage, let me give you some context. Chapters 1 to 5 tell us that God has chosen David to be king over His people. He is God's chosen king, chosen to rule over God's people. That's the summary of chapter 5. Verses 1 to 5, David becomes king over his people. The elders of the northern tribes come and say, be king over us. And David unites all 12 tribes to become king over God's people Israel. And verse 6 to the end sees David becoming king over his enemies. He defeats the Philistines, who come up again and again in 1 Samuel. He defeats them in one final battle. David is king over God's people. David is conqueror over God's enemies. So why do we need chapters 1 to 4? If you turn to the very beginning of the book, verse 1 reads, after the death of Saul, that is, the king is dead, long live the king. Saul is dead, David is king. And yet again and again, we see Saul's name popping up in chapters 1 to 4. This is chapter 2, verse 8. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, made him king. So 2 Samuel chapter 2 again. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. So Saul is dead, but Saul's kingship is very much alive. What we see in chapters 1 to 4 is a struggle between two kingdoms, David's kingdom and Saul's kingdom. What we see is a struggle between two rules, God's rule over David and man's rebellion through Saul. Now, this struggle is resolved in chapter 5 when David becomes king over God's people and God's enemies. The external struggle is over. But what we see in chapter 6, I suggest to you, is this internal struggle. Will God's king submit himself to God's rule? Will God's king humble himself as God's servant? The holiness of God. Chapter 6, verse 1. David again brought together out of Israel and chose 30,000 men in all. He and his men set out from Bela of Judah to bring from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. Now, because I did not grow up going to Sunday school, I'm ashamed to say that when I first read the Bible, I thought the Israelites walked around through the desert carrying this huge wooden boat everywhere with them for 40 years. I thought the Ark of God was referring to Noah's Ark, foolishly, of course. Most of you know that this ark is not a big boat with lots of animals in it, Noah's Ark in Genesis 6 to 8, but it's actually a small box with God's presence resting on it. The ark was the size of your average coffee table, 4 feet by 2.5 feet. It was a wooden box covered with gold. I met a student once who sheepishly admitted her dad built the Ark of the Covenant as a hobby in his garage. That's because you can find instructions for the Ark in the Bible, the book of Exodus. God gave instructions to Moses to build the Ark, which traveled with the Israelites in the desert. It symbolized God's presence with them. It symbolized God's protection over them. Inside the ark were symbols of God's power, provision, and word. That is, inside the box, Moses placed Aaron's staff, a reminder of God's power, a jar of manna, a reminder of God's provision, and the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments, God's word to Israel. None of these are mentioned, however, because verse 2 draws our attention to what's on top of the ark. The Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim that are on the ark. Crafted on top of the ark, on its lid, if you like, are 2 angelic figures, cherubim. And according to verse 2, God sits enthroned between these angelic figures. What this symbolizes is God's rule as king over the universe. The lid, elsewhere referred to as the atonement cover, is a representation of God's throne in heaven, where God rules over all his creation in the presence of his angels. We see this in Revelation chapters 4 and 5. The ark, however, was a reminder to Israel that God, the king of the universe, was their king. Why is this significant? King David, who has just been established as king over Israel, king over Israel and over his enemies in chapter 5, is bringing the ark into his capital city, as if to say, here is your true king. The 30,000 troops are not David's, they belong to God. The kingdom is not David's, it belongs to God. Verse 3. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. Uzza and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all the house of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with songs and harps, lyres, tambourines, sistrums, and cymbals. A friend visited Singapore for the first time this summer and went to my church on Sunday. She'd never been there before, so I asked her, what was the sermon about? What did you think of the preaching? She said, I can't remember, but then added, all I could remember was the pastor up front on stage playing an electric guitar. I hesitated to tell her. We first introduced that pastor to the church members many years ago with the soundtrack of Hawaii 5-0 blasting in the background. This is Pastor Jeff with the electric guitar. The ark is being transported to Jerusalem, accompanied by 30,000 soldiers. But this is far from a military procession. It's a moving worship service. David and all Israel were singing songs, with harps and tambourines and guitars. It gives us a long list of instruments. It's a full band. And here was the pastor leading his church with the electric guitar. Here was the prime minister, jamming with the music team on Sunday morning. Everyone was singing, everyone was dancing to the music. And the last person anyone expected to turn up at this worship service was God. God, verse 6. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzza reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzza because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark. You can imagine the scene replayed in slow motion. The oxen stumble over at the rocky path. The wooden cart jerks to a halt, and Uzza sees the ark of God slide to one side. Out of pure instinct, he reaches out to catch the ark before it reaches the edge of the cart, and bam, Uzza is dead. What was he supposed to do? Let the ark fall onto the ground? Then what? 10 guys would try to pick it up and all 10 guys would get zapped by God's wrath? How is that fair? Two possible explanations for God's response to Uzza's actions. The first possibility is irreverence, the irreverence of Uzza. This was a worship service, yes, but a worship service that offended God. If you like, it was the kind of worship that made them feel good, but made God look bad. Everything looked very good, the drums, the guitar, the energy, the enthusiasm, but it all made God look bad. David says in 1 Chronicles chapter 15, it was because you, the Levites, did not bring it up the first time, meaning the ark, that the Lord our God broke out in anger against us. We did not inquire of him about how to do it the prescribed way. This is 1 Chronicles 15:13. You see, hundreds of years ago, God told Moses, only the Levites were supposed to carry the ark. Even then, only those of the Kohathite clan, Numbers 4:15. It even became a warning, or they will die. And 1 Chronicles 15, which is a parallel record to 2 Samuel 6, has David laying the blame on the priests, saying, you guys should have known this. What was the problem? In their worship of God, they had ignored the word of God. They knew this would happen, but they went ahead anyways. So the first possibility is they broke the rules. God was offended and responded with judgment. It is worth mentioning that 2 Samuel 6 mentions the ark being carried on a wooden cart with 2 young cows pulling it. This was 60 years ago when the ark of God was captured. This is 1 Samuel 6. Yeah, so this was 60 years ago when the ark of God was captured by the enemy nation, the Philistines. They thought they had won the big victory by capturing Israel's God. But kind of like a scene from Raiders, the ark proved too hot to handle. Their idols got smashed. People got sick with horrible tumors. Pretty soon, the Philistines were saying, we've got to get rid of these things. What did they do? They put the ark on a cart, they hitched up 2 cows, and off they went, carrying the ark of God all the way to Abinadab's house, where we now find it 60 years later in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And you need to see that 60 years later, the Israelites decide the best way to bring the ark of God back to their city was to copy their pagan neighbors. How do we bring the ark back home? Let's do what the Philistines did. Ahio and Uzza get 2 cows. They pop the ark in the back, and off they went. This is worldly worship. This is wordless worship, ignoring God's word. It is worship that makes us look good but makes God look bad. That's the first possibility as to why God responded in wrath, anger, and judgment. But there is a second possibility. God was reminding Israel that he alone is God. David says in verse 9, how can the ark of God ever come to me? You see, David took this sign of judgment personally. This was the height of his career. He had organized this big event, got the crowd going, led the music team himself. Everyone was doing their part. Everyone, that is, except God. I think David was frustrated and surprised at God's actions that day. As a result, he dumped the ark, where it was for 3 months. You're skeptical, I can tell. Yes, even you reading this. Look back with me to chapter 5, verse 20. So David went to Baal Perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal Perazim. He is boasting. Look at the victory God has given me, describing how God broke out against his enemies, or smashed, if you like. Think Incredible Hulk smash. David is saying God smashed the bad guys. They didn't stand a chance. The Hebrew word was Perez, hence twice we read that the place was called Baal Perazim, or this place that God smashed the Baals. Now look at David's reaction to Uzza, verse 8. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out, or smashed, against Uzza. And to this day, that place is called Perez Uzza, the place where God smashed Uzza. That's what Perez Uzza means. In the past, God smashed their enemies. Here, God judges his own people. God was reminding Israel, I am holy. This Sunday, when you are in church worshiping the same God of the Bible, I wonder, is this the God you're worshiping? This holy, awesome God. For many years, the parents of a girl with severe mental disability would come regularly to church. They would sit at the back with their daughter and come to listen to the pastor preach. One day, their daughter ran up to the stage, took the mic, and made a scene in front of the whole congregation. Everyone froze. No one knew what to do except to report to the pastor, Pastor, the girl is causing trouble on stage. Do you know what he said? Good. At least now they will see her. It is possible to turn up the church, sing your heart out, leave with your convictions challenged, all the while ignoring the very God you sought to worship and the very people you sought to worship with. Of course, that's very possible. And at times, God in his wisdom and graciousness, he wakes us up to say, hey, open your eyes. David took this incident to heart. He was frustrated. In the past, God judged his enemies. Now God poured out his judgment on Israel. But there's more, because David then decides not to bring the ark back with him to Jerusalem. Instead, he deposits the ark into the care of a man named Obed-Edom. This is verse 10. He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. I heard a sermon on this very passage about Uzza and the ark by a pastor who said, when I get to heaven, I want to meet this guy, Obed-Edom, of all the people in heaven. Why Obed-Edom? Because he wanted to know what it was like for Obed-Edom to wake up the next day, to hear the knock on the door, only to open it and find David surrounded by his mighty men. Think of the Expendables, and 30,000 foot soldiers standing in front of his house saying, do you have space in your house? Will you like to leave the ark in your backyard? And by the way, whatever you do, don't touch it. Don't touch it. Otherwise you would die. It was silly. David, he dumped this ark with this guy named Obed-Edom. But notice his name isn't just Obed-Edom. It's Obed-Edom, the Gittite. Or Gittite means Gathite. Gathite means from Gath, meaning Obed was originally from this place called Gath. Who else do you know who comes from this place called Gath? David would know Back in 1 Samuel 17, David fought a giant of this man, this champion of the Philistine, a man named Goliath of Gath. And here is David leaving the ark of God in the care of a foreigner. Oh, he's a worshiper of God, but he's formerly from the Philistine city of Gath. And here's the kicker, though. What is God's response? He blessed Obed and his entire household. He blessed him. You see the reversal. God judges Israel, and now God is blessing the nations. When Israel disobeys God, God responds with the same wrath and judgment he poured out on her enemies. At the same time, he is more than willing to pour out blessing on a Philistine who has turned to worship him as the true God. I think David saw this as clear as day, and that made him afraid of God, frustrated with God, aware of God. Two possibilities to explain Uzza's judgment, a reminder and a reversal. God reminds Israel that he alone is God. God reverses his judgment to remind us that he is a gracious God. He does not owe David the kingdom. He does not owe Obed his blessing. It is a dangerous thing to worship the true and living God. You can have the time of your life, singing the songs, serving in church, pouring out your worship before God, but is this the God you're worshiping? The God who is holy, the God who reveals his will in his word. At times, God uses his blessing to remind us he is God. Other times he will use his judgment, but all towards the same end, to remind us that he is God and we are not. We exist to bring him glory. The humility of the king. As you read the following verses, keep asking yourselves this question: who is bringing the ark back to Jerusalem? Verse 12. Now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went down and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. David was wearing a linen ephod. He danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with sounds of trumpets. So, back to my question, who? Who is bringing the ark back to Jerusalem? And the answer is David, of course. He hears that God has blessed Obed-Edom, and that triggers a change in his heart. But did you notice? David is everywhere. It almost seems like David is single-handedly bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. As if he hopped on his bicycle, he headed straight for Obed's house and single-handedly brought the ark back with him. So David went down, David sacrificed the bull, David danced before the Lord. You know, and I know, he didn't do this of himself, of course. And there is the mention there of the entire house of Israel in verse 15. But it is interesting that 1 Chronicles 15 lists a whole array of priests and Levites, lots of names there. That's in 1 Chronicles 15. None of those names are here in 2 Samuel chapter 6. Here, it's David doing the sacrifice. If you look down to verse 17, David pitches the tent. Verse 18, David did all the sacrificial burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. David blessed the people. Verse 19, David gave every single person in the crowd, every single man and woman who turned up, a personal gift to bless each and every one of them. It sounds ridiculous the way it's described. David here, David there, David everywhere, doing everything. And the application of this is not, it's not the pastor must do everything. That is not the application of these verses. It is not that the pastor or the Christian leader must be able to lead worship, cook the fellowship meal, teach Sunday school kids. It's not the CV of the ideal pastor, captain of everything. Rather, it is a picture of David as the servant of everyone. He is serving God. And this snapshot of his participation in every aspect of the worship service tells us there was nothing he was unwilling to be a part of. He did the sacrifices. He blesses the people. He joined the music team. I made a joke earlier about David dancing in his pajamas, but that's not exactly true. The linen ephod that David puts on in verse 14 is the formal uniform of the Levitical priest. It was simple, but dignified. He didn't have his armor on, by the way. It means that if you took a photograph of the ceremony, the big procession heading up to Jerusalem that day, you probably wouldn't be able to tell which one was David. He looked exactly like all the other priests doing exactly the same thing, except for the fact he was the most joyful of all the priests. What's going on? Remember that David is God's chosen king over God's chosen people. The passage shows us just what kind of king he would be, a servant king, a king who serves his people. A king who loves God and does his will above all else. This is God's chosen, humble, servant king. Problem is, not everyone wants a king like this. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Michal is David's wife. That's the tragedy of the scene. David's own wife looks at him, sees clearly his joy in serving God, and despises him with her heart, his own wife. But notice how Michal is repeatedly described as Michal, daughter of Saul. Michal, daughter of Saul. Saul's kingdom is very much still alive, and Michal is her father's daughter. Verse 20. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would." Stupid man. That's what she's saying. Act your age. It is possible that Michal's words were motivated by jealousy. When she criticizes her husband's behavior in front of other women. Go back to 1 Chronicles 15, though, and you will find only men listed among the priests on duty. Now we know that women were there, all Israel, it mentions in verse 14, or verse 19, both men and women. But I don't think Michal was referring to the gender of the audience as much as she is to their rank and to their class. The slave girls of the servants is another way of saying the lowest of the low. You're not acting like a king, she's saying. You're acting like a nobody, like an idiot. At first glance, David's response sounds cruel, sounds mockingly cruel. Nye, 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 nye. God chose me, I am king. Your daddy is not king, he's dead. It sounds like he is insulting her. Verse 21, David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler of the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." Is that what he's doing? Mocking Michal by saying, God's on my side, I win, you lose. Of course not. That's not what he's saying. Rather, David is saying, I am not a king like your father. I will never be a king like your father. For Saul, the kingship meant status. It meant privilege and respect amongst his peers. For David, kingship meant humbling yourself before the true king. God's verdict alone is all that matters. I met a son of a Chinese pastor who told me what it was like, growing up as a pastor's kid. People admired and respected his dad. After all, his dad was the pastor of this Chinese church. In fact, he had described how members of the church would leave fish, fresh fish, on their doorstep. Now, if you did that for a local pastor, leaving fresh fish on their doorstep, they would think it was an insult. This dead animal. Your sermon stinks. Maybe they think this is what you're trying to say. But for a Chinese pastor, if you did that, it was a sign of honor and respect. Wow, fresh fish. How delicious. The sad truth is, though many respected that pastor, few knew him well enough to love him. It's a cultural thing. You leave gifts by the door, you pay the bill at the restaurant. It's what you would do for your boss, in a company. You see, even for a pastor, even for a Christian leader, it is possible to respect the position but ignore the person. I would caution those of you aspiring to positions of ministry, is it the position that you're aspiring to, that you desire? Is it the significance and the attention that it promises? Michal's dad was pastor, was king. If you like, her daddy was this pastor of this church. But her idea of being a pastor's wife, it meant respect, dignity, status, not humility, servanthood, and sacrifice. It was a shock to her system. It didn't make sense to her, and that's why she ends up despising both the person as well as the position. Verse 22, I will be even more undignified than this. This is David saying this. I'll be even more undignified. And I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor. David is saying, you think I'm an idiot. I tell you, I'm worse than an idiot. I look in the mirror and I see a sinner. I see a nobody, but by the grace of God. And I would rather everyone see me for the loser that I am, because then they would see how great God is in choosing me and loving me into his kingdom. Is that what people see when they look at you? When you go home, do your uncles and aunties say, "Wow, come lek chaya, tok Cambridge wow, smart boy, smart girl you study in Cambridge The same uncles and aunties, they will scold your cousin saying, "Why are you so stupid? Can't you be more like that Cheche or that Coco?" And then what do you say? Of course. Most of us, we will say nothing. We might feign embarrassment on the outside, but inside our hearts, we beam with pride. We think, yeah, I'm the hot stuff. Remember what Paul said to the Corinthians. This is chapter 3 and verse 18. Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you think you are wise by the standards of this age, you should become fools so that you might become wise. Friends, I invite you to do the same. By Cambridge standards, you're wise, I know, but be foolish. Be foolish in the love for Christ. In the years that you spend here as a student, in the decision to choose this job or that job, what would be the foolish option that in God's estimation would actually be much wiser for his glory and not your own? Be the kind of fool that says to the world, I'm worse than a fool. I'm a sinner, but I'm loved by God and I serve my Savior. Are you king over your own lives? Or is God the rightful ruler over your life, your degree, your online habits, your marriage, your credit card? A pastor recently challenged me and he said, we do not live our lives by years, by months, or even by days, but by moments. Do we surrender each moment to Jesus and say to him, all my life is yours? Or do we isolate moments for our own gain, for my own pleasure? I decide what I do, what I say, because this part of this life, this moment, this is mine. The passage ends on a terrible note. This is verse 23, and Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. It's a horrible, horrible judgment upon her and on any woman to be deprived of the joy of children, of being a mother. But the bigger picture reminds us that this is a judgment God pours out on Saul's house and Saul's rule. There would be no more descendants in Saul's line. In contrast, chapter 7 is God's great promise that David's kingdom would continue for eternity. From his line would come a king to rule the nations. From his line would come Jesus, who died to save the nations. The opposite of joy. At the same time, the end of the passage reveals an important lesson. It reveals the antithesis of our joy in God, the opposite of joy. It's not sadness from God, but pride in ourselves. I am king over my life, and I like it that way. The scary thing is Saul was king for 40 years. Many people wanted a king like Saul, a kind of king who embodied power and prestige and fought their battles for them. But the more they strived for that kingdom, the less they submitted to God and to one another. The opposite of the joy that comes from serving God and submitting to God, it's not sadness, it's pride. People can be very happy serving themselves, and God lets them for a time. On the other hand, the person who rejoices in God does not always look like a happy bunny. David here, he's angry, frustrated, and I suspect depressed during those 3 months. But his joy was centered on God. It was not an emotion, it was his submission. It meant he always located his source of significance outside himself, in God's approval, in God's love. The main thing that is keeping us from delighting from God, it's not quiet time, it's not having the right emotional makeup, it's not our circumstance. Ultimately, if you are a real Christian, the only thing keeping you from delighting in God is God himself. There are still parts of us that resist submitting to him. And the last thing you should do in such circumstances is to try and fake it. A report last year suggests that 25% of CEOs are psychopaths. They get the job done, but they fake the emotions of empathy that their employees expect them to have. You can fake the emotions people expect you to have as a Bible study leader, a pastor, a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, a dutiful Cambridge student serving on the Christian Union. You can do that, and no one will be the wiser except for God. And what you would lose is God himself. Don't let that happen. Locate your joy in God in any and every circumstance. That's what our Lord Jesus Christ did on the cross. It meant scorning the shame. People thought of him as a fool, but Jesus did his Father's will, and he set his sights on his Father's joy. And that's how we know Jesus is God's chosen king, to rule over his people and over his enemies. Fix your eyes on him. This is Hebrews 12, verse 2. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And that's it. That's a sermon I preached. It's a talk that I gave to the CF 7 years ago. It's called The Opposite of Joy, based on 2 Samuel chapter 6. Thank you for listening. Take care. Have a good weekend, and God bless.